G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. This week Adam starts us off in a brand new series entitled One But Two. He asks, we're one, but what does it look like to also have individuality in the context of marriage and relationships?
Okay. What I would like to do is provoke a conversation, create a conversation in which we talk about the apparent contradiction of oneness and separateness. Like as we talk about relationships, and particularly as we talk about marriage, we throw around a word. The word is oneness. It's kind of a churchy word, and it's not a word necessarily probably any of us use all that often. And yet there is an assumption to a conversation about marriage, and that is that two become one. And even people who don't necessarily follow Jesus are using that language at their wedding. The two shall become one. And I think part of what we have to get inside of, and I know it's been tremendously helpful for Teresa and I within this conversation, because we are not experts, we're learners just like you, is to understand that there is a tension between oneness and separateness, and that we have to figure out how to manage that, because we're not going to solve it. Because solving it means we have all oneness, or solving it means we have all separateness. And I suppose, if nothing else, what I would like to suggest in this series is that neither of those is God's best. And quite frankly, neither of those works particularly well. And so this morning, I don't know where you're at in your relationships and you're thinking about life and marriage and family and all those things. I have zero interest in addressing those of you who maybe are delightfully happy and going like, I don't have anything to learn. Listen, the last thing I would want to do is say, well, good job, but you're doing it wrong. That's not the way we roll. And quite frankly, if you're not really interested in what like God might have to say about all that, I totally respect that as well. And the last thing I'd want to say is, well, like, good job, but you're not doing it God's way. It's not that I don't think God has a way. It's that I don't think God starts conversations that way. But for those of you who in some way are intrigued by relationship, you're a learner. You're at this place where your marriage is good, but it's not great. You're at this place where you think your marriage is about over. You're at this place where you're engaged and you're hoping you're engaged to the right kind of person. I guess and this is more true of this series. I know I say this all the time, but I sincerely mean it. I don't have all the answers. What I want to do is start conversations and create drawings over napkins that I think can become tremendously helpful in your relationships. And the question that I want to ask this morning is simply this, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one but separate. And then in the next week, I want to talk about one but separate but one, like one but two, and then one but two but one. And then in the last one, we're going to talk about the fact that relationships are dynamic, which is something that I'm very good at because I'm such an adaptable person. I'm glad you really thought that was funny. So here's the question. What if? What if in order for this, right? Because we get the kind of the fancy, the sentimental, the great thing at a wedding. Like, what if in order for oneness to really work, there has to be separateness? I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but what if marriage isn't all oneness? What if there's an implied separateness? And what if in order for, maybe we could say it this way, what if in order for this to work, we've got to find a way to also have this? She's been terribly uncooperative every gathering. He just goes straight, follows the line, and she's like, really, you don't think that's funny? But it's true. Like, look at how hard I got to work to get her to go anywhere. Seriously. Can we just pray? Because I think I just described marriage. Just kidding. That's not true. Maybe I've gone too far. What if this has to happen? And this is what I want to delve into. What if there's the need for both? Recently, Teresa and I, we kept, and I asked her permission to share this story, but we kept bumping into this idea, and I'll unpack it a little bit more in a little while. And it wasn't a constant irritant, and it wasn't always a dramatic irritant, though at times it was, but there was this concept, this thing, that we would refer to it as post-UL marriage, and that was this conference and this experience and these things we'd learned, and it was like we had this new paradigm given to us, and we weren't quite sure how to take the new paradigm and apply it to the old paradigm. It was like these new things we were learning about what it means to be people and individuals, but we couldn't quite figure out, like, so how does that fit into the context of marriage? And so my wife, who's much more intelligent than I, she said, hey, you know that therapist you're always telling people to go see? Oh, yeah. Maybe we should go see her. No, I don't like that. Like, I like recommending people go see her, and I just sit on my high stool. I like to go see her by myself because I know I'm an idiot, but I don't know necessarily. And so finally we went. And what happened is this is, many of you are like, this is what happens. You sit on the couch, and then they say, what? So what's the problem? And then what do you say, dudes? I don't know. Like, suddenly you can't articulate it. Have you noticed that? And I'm sorry if I'm being very gender type here. I realize that we can cross over, but this is my struggle. Like, I have problems during the week when the therapist isn't next to me for me to actually articulate them. And then there's this moment where I get to go articulate them, and suddenly I have no words. And so we fumbled, and we kind of worked our way through it, and we were trying to sound coherent, and Teresa was making much more sense than I was. And finally she stopped us. By the way, I feel really bad for that whole she's non-cooperative thing. I'm really sorry about that. Finally, she stopped us, and she asked us a question, and she drew a drawing. SNL in the 1990s liked to draw drawings. She asked a question, and she drew a drawing, and I'm not kidding. The whatever metaphor you want to use, the lights came on for us in a way that it blew my mind. So here was the question. She just simply asked, so something like, I don't even remember the exact question because it was the drawing that was really helpful to me because I like simplicity. She said, what's your picture of marriage? What's your picture of the ideal marriage? And you're kind of like, oh, that's esoteric and high. And then she grabbed a yellow pad, this is why you don't go see therapists, right? Because you're afraid they're going to draw things and then say, what do you see? And it freaks you out. She grabbed a notepad and she drew, and the first thing she drew were 2 circles. And they looked something like this. Now, of course, what she's saying is that each circle represents an individual, and she said, is what you're wanting in a marriage, and again, this is very subjective. We're not even in the what does God want? We're not in that range at all. We're just saying, what are you after? And the first one is this what you're after? Are you after separateness? Are you after 2 people who live in the same house and maybe even sleep in the same bed and probably spend from the same checking account, but really your buddies, your pals, your roommates, your friends, and those are all great things, but as we'll talk about next week, that's not necessarily what makes oneness. Is this what you're after? And it strikes me that if this is where you're at, and one of the fun things I think about this whole deal is the ability to draw it on a napkin afterwards and work through it yourself, and we'll come back to that too. But if this is where you're at, it may be for very good reason. Because you may have tried oneness. Maybe in the marriage you're in right now, you tried it, and it hurt. And you put up some walls, and maybe consciously and maybe subconsciously, but you're not going there again. Maybe you're in a second or a third marriage, and you tried it in the first one, but you're not willing to do it again. Or maybe you walked down the aisle, and there was this oneness, and then there was his temper, and then there was this dynamic, and suddenly, and maybe for the first time you're realizing it, maybe it's been a very conscious decision. There's a relationship, but you've drawn a line in the sand at the word vulnerability. And again, for good reason, because to be vulnerable it can be terrifying. I was reminded of this and how innate it is in our understanding recently. One of my favorite things in the world to do is run, and trail run in particular. And I've thought to myself how fun it would be if one of the boys fell in love with running, just because that would create all these experiences together and whatever. But I also don't want to be that guy who's like, my son does 500 push-ups a day and he's 5 years old. So, they kind of just leave it unsaid and go with it. And our youngest, there's a running club at the school. I think many of your schools have those where they're training for the Governor's Cup. And he came home like, hey, I'm training for the Governor's Cup. And great. And I just made the decision to kind of let it be his thing. And he kind of kept mentioning it. And so one evening, I guess, I was like, hey, you want to go for a run? Yeah, he said. And so we went and ran 1.5 miles. And he talked and ran the whole time. Next day, he's like, hey, you want to go for a run? Yeah, he said, let's do it. And we ran 2 miles. And we ended that run at the Big Dipper. No manipulation tactics involved whatsoever. And so we were walking home from the Big Dipper, and I said, hey, was that fun? He said, oh yeah, that was fun. Dad, did you have fun? Or something like that. And I said, oh man, I said, if you fell in love with running, that would be a dream for me. And as soon as I said the phrase, his face just turned red and he just kind of clammed up. I was like, I'm trying to think, what did I just say? I mean, I don't think I said anything bad. Finally, I said, what did I say? And he said, Dad, I can't believe you said that phrase. It's like, what? You mean fell in love with? He's like, yes. You said it again. And I asked his permission to share this too. He said, Dad, I've never used that phrase before. I was like, what? Why? And he said, because I'm afraid if I used it, then I might accidentally use it at school. And if this isn't a glimpse not only of like what I'm talking about, but peer pressure, he said, and then I'm afraid if I use it at school, somebody might think I was talking about a girl. This is scary stuff. I wonder if you long ago abandoned the oneness project, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously. And you know what? It doesn't even have to be a wound from a relationship. And I'm not a therapist, I can recommend one, but part of what we know, part of what they know, part of what research tells us is even just things that go on before there ever was a relationship can cause you to go like, no. Like I can figure out how to do life on my own. But to become that dependent and that vulnerable and that like, no, it's not happening. And so she asked, is this what you're after? Buddies, friends? In some ways, I think this can describe the marriage where you leave maybe a parent's house, not all parents, but a parent's house, and you go, I don't ever want a marriage like that. What are you describing? Two people who've somehow navigated in so many tragic cases to keep the peace, but you just have this sense that there's not that. And I don't mean like the honeymoon stuff that nobody has forever. I mean the just like connection stuff. Next drawing she drew was this one. Right, and then the sperm hits the cell and it divides into two and we have a baby. Just kidding. A couple of things to note here, and they're both intentional. First, notice that the inner circle is smaller, and notice they're both the same color. And what we're describing here is one personality completely encompassing, engulfing, taking over another personality. Now, sometimes this is intentional and sometimes it's unintentional. This is what I would call absolute oneness. It's a oneness where there is no separateness, and that is by design. It is a oneness in which there's not you wouldn't dare recreate or have relationship or do anything separately. Now, I think one of the challenges here, and I think, sorry, go ahead, sorry about that. I have ADD, they all know it. I think if this describes your relationship, one of the really tricky things to ask yourself is, what are you afraid of? Like, why do you need to smother? Like, do you have the capacity to be in relationship and risk losing, but not have to control? I think one of the questions you ask, if this is the dynamic that strikes you, is it really possible to control and experience intimacy? I think another question to ask is, what if the opposite of love isn't hate, but it's control? These are all ideas, by the way, that Donald Miller explores in his new book called Scary Close. I think what can happen here, and again, maybe you had oneness at one point. Maybe with the one you're with now, maybe in another relationship, and something happened, and you got your guts ripped out, and it was painful, and maybe subconsciously you vowed to self that you're never going through that again. And there's a couple ways to prevent that. One is to just not do it, no oneness ever again. Another is to go, you're never getting away from me. And you control, and you demand, and you're stuck in this paradoxical arrangement where you're insisting upon intimacy, but you can't have it if you're insisting upon it. You know, I think one of the observations that I've made of myself is, and as I've watched many of you and friends, is that in relationships, there's almost always a type A controller. You know, the one that has an idea and a plan and like kind of throws a fit if they don't get it. And then have you ever noticed, like most marriages, there's the type A controller, and then there's the, I don't even know if they deserve to have a type, that like adaptable, kind of accommodationist, kind of like go with the flow, whatever. Have you noticed that? Like, and sometimes we unnecessarily and inaccurate, like do the role thing like I did earlier with the woman, but often there's almost always, have you noticed, one person that just has to have their way, and then they manage to find somebody who's like, whatever. And part of what I've observed is that about myself, is I've often assumed that marriage would get a whole lot better if I would be less type A. that somehow being type A is a problem. And I think if we're to be honest, oftentimes as Christ followers in particular, we celebrate the really flexible, accommodating person because that person so looks like Christ. You know, they're willing to drop everything and serve anyone, and they don't have an agenda, and they're just willing to kind of go with the flow, and that looks so much like the way we picture Jesus. What if type A isn't good or bad? And kind of like hippie, like let's just sit on the curb and drink water and we'll never invent the wheel because we need a type A. Like what if that's not good or bad? In fact, what if we need type A's because like we need to go places and we don't want to just sit on the curb and someone needs to invent the wheel and figure out fire and electricity would be like we need those people, but we also need these people. See, I think some of this is a personality thing, and I guess what I'm trying to pose is if you're the type A one, what if there's a tendency to just take over? And that can get unhealthy, and you can be driven by fear. But conversely, what if you're this type X one? I think one of the more scary things you could begin to explore, and what I've observed is if that's your tendency, it's terrifying, and that is to explore the permission you have to have self and to find the healthy tension between serving someone else and losing yourself to somebody else and putting someone else first. And yet the commands of Christ aren't just love God and love people. They're love God and love people as you love yourself. And this person can be driven by fear. And so can this one. And this person manages their fear by glomming on to the relationship. And this person manages their fear by just keeping the peace and never having a desire and making sure they don't ever stand up for self. What if there's another option? And that was ultimately what she explored. In the third drawing, well, it was, here we go, basic science. It was a Venn diagram. And I know this might sound nerdy to you, but when she drew that, I had this like aha moment of what? And she began to explain, what if there's a way? What if there's a way to have the both and? What if the picture of a great marriage, and again, she wasn't even necessarily prescribing this, but she was saying, what if this is an option? And what if what you guys are trying to figure out is this option, but you don't even have the category for it, and you kind of think it's one or the other? What if this is a realistic option? This kind of paradoxical, like, well, is marriage one or is it two? Could I have option C, please? Maybe it's both. See, immediately what I realized as she was describing this is this spoke to the tension that we were dealing with. And it also speaks to the fear I was dealing with. Because as we were trying to explore, like, how do you have self? And as I was trying to explore, how do I be less controlling? And Teresa was trying to explore, like, how do I be more true to self? What I realized is there's this gear in my head. And it's what makes me visionary. It's what makes me a type A. It's what makes me love thinking about the future and planning. It's something we're going to explore in a new series starting in the middle of July called Help I Feel, where we're going to talk about the fact that the degree to which you think about and plan for the future is directly correlated to the degree to which you worry about and have anxiety for the future, because the prefrontal cortex in your brain, it's what gives you both abilities. And what I realized was the assumption that I operate under. And if you're sleeping, just please hear me here. What I realize is the assumption that I operate under is as I allow for some separation, I project a place where there's absolute separation. If I allow for some separateness, then my brain, because my brain is constantly thinking about the future, it can only envision a future, whether it takes months or years or decades, where there's total separateness. In other words, there's an option that I didn't even consider viable. And as I walked out of her office, the next question that began to roll through my head was, wait a minute. But how does this fit with what the scriptures say about oneness? And what does God mean about oneness if he doesn't mean the two overlapping circles? Because in the Bible, the text uses a very specific word for oneness. The marriage relationship, it's this word ahad. Go ahead and say ahad. You got to do that like gross dry throat thing in the back. Ahad. Makes that dangly thing flap around. Ahad, right? One more time. Ahad. It's a Hebrew word. Here it is. Wrong chapter. Oh yeah. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and he's united to his wife, and they become ahad, one. Jesus quotes this exact same verse in Matthew. Someone's asking him about the difficulty of marriage and trying to navigate divorce and how do we think about all this and how do we work through what our culture says about this. And he says this, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife and the two will become ahad. That's what God uses to describe the marriage relationship. Seems kind of clear. One, until... And I'm indebted to several people on this, but until for me the realization came that God also uses this word to describe himself. And what do we know of God in the way he describes himself in Scripture? What we know is that he describes himself as one, but many within the one. One of the things that thinkers have been wrestling with all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 is this God who claims that he's one, that he's monotheistic, that there's one of him, and yet there's several parts of him. Even today, many monotheistic thinkers outside of Judaism and Christianity, especially Muslims, they struggle to think of Christianity as a movement that celebrates one God because the way in which this God talks about himself as several within the one, what we call the Trinity. Listen to Genesis chapter 1. Here's the first maybe hint of the God who thinks of himself as one but separate. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Now there's this like, okay, God, who are you talking to? Like, where are they? Who's the us? I mean, if you like to blot out the passages that make you squirm, this is a good one to skip. Because you have this God who's referring to himself in the plural and yet maintaining that he's one. In fact, here is like the crescendo verse on God's oneness, Deuteronomy chapter 6, a verse that Jesus would have recited every morning and every evening, a verse that modern day Orthodox Jews hold with such incredible passion. They recite it every morning and every evening. Listen to this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But guess what the word is? Ahad. God goes, I'm one. But you know how I used us and our? You know how I keep referring to myself as, and Jesus takes it to the next level, Father, Son, and Spirit? That's what ahad means. Ahad is a community of oneness. Ahad is a relationship of one. And you go like, how do we fit these two things together? That's what we're doing in this series, because categorically they don't belong. Like water can't be dry, right? We were leaving a baseball game. Some of you may remember on this last Tuesday, there was that really cool double rainbow. And as we were leaving, one of my sons was like, Dad, will you take a picture of that and send it to me on my phone? And I was like, well, I will, but it won't work. He's like, what do you mean it won't work? And I'm like, you've seen rainbows in magazines all the time. You yawn and flip the page. Like you can't take a picture of a rainbow. What you can do is experience a rainbow. And sure enough, we're pulling out of the lot, and there are literally people pulled all over Henderson, like taking pictures of this rainbow. And don't you just roll your eyes and go, yeah, you'll think it's cool, and all your friends will go, that's so lame. It's a rainbow. That seems to be the way the scriptures describe this God who's one but many. Like every time you try to put words to it, you're like, oh, you lost me. Listen to what Jesus does in John chapter 15. In John 15, and I think this is just one of the verses that captures this dynamic. When the advocate comes, just count the number of persons. When the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father. Do you see that? Father, advocate, and Son, I. Advocate, Holy Spirit, I, Jesus speaking in the first person, Father, somehow same as and yet separate from. Which raises this question, what if God very intentionally used a word to describe oneness in a relationship, and he used the same word to describe the oneness that is present within his own personhood? What if God says, hey, that whole marriage thing, why don't you model it after me? Who has what we know, and if you've never read the book The Shack, I highly recommend it, of this God who didn't create out of loneliness or relational need, who is somehow completely fulfilled by the relationship amongst the Trinity. What if it's possible? And so I looked at Joan. I'm like, okay, that all sounds good. And I'm realizing that there's this tension. And it's the fear of like staying in the overlap. Because I don't know if you can relate to that, but there's this sense, isn't there, of like, I think I can maintain like the two overlapping circles. I think I can maintain the two separate circles. There's this dynamic tension between a partially overlapping set of circles. And so I said to her, perhaps the question you're asking, so practically speaking, how in the world would you ever do this? How would you ever maintain this? Now, of course, there's lots that could be said, and maybe some of them we'll explore next week. But I was fascinated by what she suggested is best practice from her clinical standpoint, because it was so grossly simple that you'll never come to a gathering because of an email again, because you'll go like, he doesn't deliver. Her solution was so simple. She said, what we know creates the oneness in the midst of the separateness is the evening conversation. Now, I'm going to give you it from my kind of kids at home, that context. She said, what we know is the kids are in bed, and there's just like, they'll only be there for 10 minutes, so hurry up and talk. Kids are in bed, and you've experienced a day separate from one another. Emotionally separate. You've had feelings and experiences that the other one doesn't know about. And the way you maintain the togetherness, the oneness in the midst of the separateness, she said, is you learn to embrace those times and have conversations in those times and talk not just about experiences, but feelings, something we'll talk more about in that next series. You grab your favorite beverage, you sit down in your favorite chair, and dare I say, you turn off the stinking TV and you share what you experience. Now, for me, there was this liberating sense of ease that came with, okay, so it's okay to experience things separate, but the key is that we're sharing them. And then next week, we'll explore how we create this oneness, or at least some ideas. Listen, my hope for you is maybe for you, maybe you just need to sit across from one another. Maybe you're here and he's not, or you're here and she's not. Maybe there used to be one kid, but now there's two, and suddenly you're like, which way's up? But maybe I've had such fun with this in conversations with friends, to just sit across from them, and maybe you need to draw the little drawing and go, so which one are we? Like, where are we right now? And which one do we want to be? And let's just not even spiritualize it initially. Not even which one does God want us to be. What's the goal here? What captures what we're trying to accomplish? And how do we get there? And probably it's not going to come with just one conversation. It's probably going to take a lot of work and a little bit of change. Maybe you're dating. Maybe you're engaged. And one of the most important conversations you could have is, what's your ideal? What's the picture? I think right next to what percentage of your income are you going to live on is the conversation, like what one do we want? And do we want the same thing? Because many of us come from these relationship backgrounds where we've never seen intimacy. We've seen raising kids, never seen intimacy. And others of us come from these kind of classic Germanic, we settled the West and we can't do it unless we completely lose ourselves in the other, and so therefore that's what marriage is supposed to be. And it's not that we're chauvinists. It's that we don't have any concept of any other options. You know where else I think this comes into play is the way we think about God. That God is giving us not just a picture of himself, not just a picture of marriage, but a picture of what it looks like to live in relationship with him. I wonder for how many of you, when you think of God, what you think of is hostile takeover, where all sense of personality and individuality and interest is bleached out of the system, and he replaces it with this wooden kind of robotic thing. And the pictures that the scriptures create are actually something entirely different. A God who creates a garden and says to people, like, let's do this together. And yes, I'm God, so I'll have ideas that you've not thought of. And yes, I'm God, and so you surrender to me. But life with me is the best opportunity for life at its fullest. Listen, it's not lost on me that we've barely even started a conversation, and that's my goal. What's the goal? What's the win? What's the picture? And how hard are you willing to work to get it there? I'd like to pray for you. God, like almost anything, this is so much easier to talk about than it is to flesh out. And Lord, we're each and every one of us, we're products of a system. And so to change results requires some major rehardwiring of the way we think and process and go about life. God, I think of the marriages in this room, the couples in this room, that you would provoke very real, very candid conversation about the past and the present and the desired future. God, I pray that you'd give us the type of tenacity and the type of courage and the type of vulnerability that's essential if we're actually to make progress in these conversations. And God, as we think about adding kids to the equation, as we think about adding just new seasons of life, maybe being an empty nester again, maybe in a relationship for the first time in years, God, would you give us the wisdom to follow you in the moment and to lean back on the principles that we can rely upon from you. Jesus, that we wouldn't be here if there wasn't this sincere desire for growth, and we are so grateful that you lead us into life at its very best. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.